Hello, folks. Welcome to another program with Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's December 8th, 2022, and this is our book talk on Twas the Night with author Pamela McColl. Before we begin, I just want to remind folks that Maine Historical Society recognizes that what is currently referred to Maine is Wabanaki homeland, a place that Wabanaki people have stewarded, for over 13,000 years. And wherever we are in Maine, we are on Wabanaki homelands. And we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Micmac, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we are committed to helping provide education about this history through partnerships with Wabanaki people. I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening. Pamela McColl is a Canadian author, historian, and advocate of children's issues and smoking cessation. Best known for releasing a smoke-free version of the classic, Twas the Night Before Christmas. The book won several awards, including 3 Benjamin Franklin Book Awards from the Independent Book Publishers Association and a Moonbeam Children's Book Award. She's the publisher of 7 books, including Pacific Spirit, The Forest Reborn, which U.S. Senator Frank Murkowski, chair of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, labeled as one of the most important works on forest management in recent years. And tonight she's here to talk with us about her most recent publication, Twas the Night, which is this really gorgeous, or Twas the Night, I should say, the art and history of the classic Christmas poem. This gorgeous book that she's spent years researching and working on. Of course, at Maine Historical Society and the childhood home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's, we are poetry fans, and certainly fans of poetry for children, which was something that Henry wrote a lot of, and he really loved children and children loved him. So this seemed like a perfect fit for us at this time of year. So thank you so much, Pamela, for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely. I started working on my book 10 years ago because I knew that it would be 200 years this Christmas Eve. It's the bi-centennial of the writing of the poem in New York by Clement C. Moore. Clement C. Moore wrote it for his children and his family that evening, Christmas Eve, and it went on to become an international phenomena. I started the book and I thought I'd be just writing about Clement C. Moore and Chelsea and New York and a little history of the editions and the vintage editions and the artists that came to it. But it flowered into this immense historical research project because I had to go back to the Roman Empire, where the beginning of the legend of anonymous giving through St. Nicholas began. But before I get into this part of it, I wanted just to say that, with Longfellow and with Winslow Homer and the Wyeth family, all in my book, there's a big piece here for Maine. I think that'll be of interest to you. I was, 14 years old, and the first Christmas present I actually remember saving up for myself was a book of the art of Andrew Wyeth. And so one of my very favorites. And I considered putting N.C. Wyeth on the cover of this book because I am an enormous fan of his work as well. But I ended up choosing this image by Helen Chamberlain because this image has a very interesting story. It came from the archives of the William and Mary University at the Swem Library, where one of the biggest collections of the poem is housed. It's the Nancy Marshall collection. And I found this image and I just loved it. But I couldn't find very much about the artist. And I was intrigued that we couldn't find out who she was. And so I did some real digging and I discovered that she had, her life had been pieced together by a journalist who had found some boxes of discarded postcards and cards and art images out on the sidewalk, and had taken them home and pieced together a story about her life. And I just thought that was an interesting story. I also did it because there's a real thread through my book of very famous American women artists. And I think that sometimes they're not, the early artists aren't given the credit maybe that they deserve. The Puritans, as you know, loved to read. They taught their children to read, boys and girls. And so there's a long history of not only literary female talents coming from early America all the way through, but also art. And it comes from women who were involved in hand coloring magazines and illustrations back before the age of printing and color. It was all done by hand. And from that work, and thanks to the great Howard Ply, who stipulated at the Drexel Institute that half of his class had to be women, you had some really wonderful talents come through in the likes of Jessie Wilcox Smith and Gertrude Kay. So there's this great legacy of women in the arts in America, literary and in the visual arts, that go right back to the days of the Pilgrims. And so I think that that's interesting. So this is one of the reasons I put Helen Chamberlain on the cover of my book. And on the back of my book, I put an image by Louis Prang, who was a German who came to America, who really established 4-color printing and really got color images out there in a reproductive way. And I like to say that he democratized art because he made it available for the average homeowner, to put on their walls, and it greatly influenced interior design. So I think that he, again, needs to be recognized for his great contribution to the world of art and bringing it to people. So it was a wonderful project to work on, but as I said, it definitely took on a life of its own. And I had to move past New York and Chelsea where it was written. When I was doing my research, it was just absolutely fascinating how many artists, like Winslow Homer or like the Wyeths, they either came to the poem or were inspired by the poem and drew, wonderful images from it. Not necessarily illustrating editions of the poem, but in their commercial and their fine art, they certainly did. Andrew Wyeth, later in life, N.C. Wyeth's son, of course, does a postcard, a Christmas card, and he puts a bed with stockings hung on the bedposts. So the open window, it was a Christmas card, and his wife, Betsy, did a image of Santa Claus. So the Wyeths were very, very big into Christmas. And N.C. Wyeth used to jump up on the roof in a Santa costume and really, really enjoyed the whole experience, as did other great characters such as Mark Twain, who, again, got all dressed up and loved the whole Santa Claus. So I found that I just came back from a 21-day tour, and I was in New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York. And wherever I went, from Hartford to New Haven to Springfield, there's a story there related to this poem and great artists and literary talent. So it's just been really an American story, not just a New York story, which I found really interesting. So I'll just get my screen going here. Get the next slide. Sorry. Why are we not moving slides? What happened? Here we are. So Clement C. Moore, he was the poet of this wonderful poem that we all love. He was a very interesting man himself. He was a graduate of Columbia. He gave the valedictorian address to his university class, and it was called Gratitude. Unfortunately, we do not have that speech. It's been lost. I work with Columbia archivists to try and find it, but we cannot find it. So that was very unfortunate. He was born into a very wealthy family. His mother, Charity Moore, was a clerk. Her father had been Thomas Clark, who had owned a great deal of land. In his retirement from the British Army, he came to Manhattan and settled. And Moore also had a very interesting father. His father is the bishop, Benjamin Moore, who was the bishop of the Diocese of New York. He gives the last rites to Alexander Hamilton after the duel. And it's really interesting that Benjamin Moore is the one who wrote the notes on the fact that it was a duel. And had he not done that, we may never have known it was a duel and not just a gunshot wound, because back in the day, of course, it was illegal to participating in a duel. So I think that's kind of an interesting little piece of history. The Moores lived in Chelsea. They were very wealthy, and they ended up developing the area and donating a lot of land to the General Theological Seminary, where the Highland Hotel sits today. And Moore was a very well-educated man. He spoke multiple languages, played multiple instruments. He introduced Italian opera to New York. and he was part of a literary circle called the Knickerbockers. And we all know, Washington Irving, of course, is the center of the Knickerbockers. Moore goes on to marry, has a great love, and they have lots of love letters and poetry written back and forth. And then he has 8 children, and his wife dies in her 30s, along with several of the children. And he carries on, he never remarries, and he works at the General Theological Seminary. He writes other poetry, he writes other serious work, and he is well regarded in his community as a very generous and loving father and grandfather. He ends up later in life moving to Newport, where he eventually dies in 1863, and he's interned at Trinity. So he's a really interesting man. No one's ever written a full biography on him, which is very unfortunate. But in my book, there's a good chapter on him, and I go into his very interesting relatives, including Lady Holland of Kensington, the notorious Lady Holland, and all kinds of other really interesting people. And I just, thoroughly enjoyed getting to know Clement C. Moore through the work I did. He didn't keep a diary, which is very unfortunate. He did keep one for the last couple of years of his life, I think 5 years, but it's a diary that really just speaks to daily activities and the weather and all kinds of sort of mundane things. And he does not talk about this poem at all, which is too bad. This is their home in Chelsea. This is Chelsea House. This is where they lived, and this is the house that we think that the poem was written in, and where it was first read on Christmas Eve of 1822. And eventually this home is torn down and thrown into the Hudson River, and they make an embankment, and the Moores move into a townhouse in Chelsea. And of course, some are at Newport, where they eventually end up living at the end of his life. So it's very unfortunate that we don't have a museum for Clement C. Moore. There's not a statue anywhere in New York, but there's a park. There's a park, the Clement C. Moore Park in Chelsea, and there's a park in Elmhurst where his grandparents had a homestead. And lots of events go on there, including on Christmas. Children meet to hear the poem read. And they also have a practice in New York of taking a parade or a procession to his gravesite on Christmas Eve and laying a wreath with candles and saying the poem. And they continue that to this day. They didn't do it during COVID, but they're doing it again. The poem itself was first printed in the Troy Sentinel newspaper on December the 23rd of 1823. So it's a year after it's first read by Moore. And it's interesting that I've been, very vocal on this year being a celebration of the poem, because this is the year it was first written and read. But next year, I know the city of Troy and Manhattan are doing more, because it's the celebration of the publication of the poem being 200 years old. So it's a much bigger deal. But what was interesting was that when it was first published in the Troy Sentinel, it appeared on page 4, and it was put there by Orville Hawley, the editor of the Troy Sentinel at the time. And he did it without an illustration. It was just, there it was on page 4, sort of, it may have been a last minute sort of decision, because it wasn't even in the poetry column, which the Troy Sentinel usually ran. And what Hawley did was he wrote a wonderful preface to it. And that preface followed the poem when it was republished in other newspapers in the months and years to come. It was reprinted immediately. People recognized the merit of the piece, and they loved reprinting it in papers across America. And then it made its way into almanacs, and then we'll get into this, but it gets into publication in book form. And here we have an 1830, so it's 7 years later. This is again printed in the Troy Sentinel, but this time it has an illustration by Myron King. It's a woodcut. So this is considered to be the first illustration of this poem. And we do not know the location of that original woodcut, which is, again, unfortunate. The poem, as I mentioned, was published all over the place. And what was really interesting was that because it was published anonymously, people felt they could, have quite a bit of license on how they printed it in terms of punctuation, changing of the language. In 1828, you see Happy Christmas change for Merry Christmas, and you start to see the title change. So it's first published as Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, and then it's republished as An Account, of a visit from St. Nicholas. And then it morphs into "Twas the Night Before Christmas," "The Night Before Christmas," and all kinds of other versions of it, as does some of the other language. So it's been, altered many, many, many times. In 1841, it appears in the Mirror in New York as a newspaper. And what's interesting about this is that this is an image by Ingram, and this is the first time we've ever seen Santa Claus descending a chimney that we know of. And this article is also interesting because it's not on Christmas Eve. They put it back to New Year's Eve, because back in this period, people were not doing Christmas the way that we think, the way we do it, or the way that Clement C. Moore in 1822 was doing it. They still are reverting to New Year's Eve, which was the popular time then to give trinkets to children, candies, and to celebrate, often with quite rambunctious activity associated with it, drinking and festing and festivities and feasting and all these things, and guns and all kinds of things. So it is interesting to see in 1841 you still have this New Year's Eve wrapped up with St. Nicholas concept. They gave out St. Nicholas cookies at New Year's Eve from way back. So it's this transition into Christmas Eve that's so important to us because it's the way we celebrate it. The year after this appears, in 1842, you see the same image being used for the selling of wares by the Pierce Variety Store in Albany. So this image is actually the first commercialization or the use of Santa Claus to sell products that we know of. This image and this paper, the original, are actually on display at the Albany Institute right now. They pulled it out for me and they put it in their lobby. And it's just really fun to see original work like that. So as I mentioned, after we have the poem reprinted in papers and almanacs, it shows up, it starts to be printed in books. And we have, I think it's 1848, it's the first black and white illustrated copy of the poem in a book form. And then by 1855, Clement C. Moore's daughter, Mary, she does an illumination in full color. So it would have been all hand done, but that's the first full color illustration of the poem is actually by his daughter. And I think that that's really lovely. The original is in the vault of the, I've been told, of the Moore family to this day. And it was reproduced in a couple of magazines in the 1950s with permission from the family. But it's never, and there's some facsimiles you can find online, but the original has not exhibited to my knowledge. This image is just a lovely example of a luxury book that was printed of the poem in the 19th century. Another lovely image. Again, in my book, I have lots of these images from these beautiful, beautiful vintage editions of the poem. So as I mentioned earlier, it all begins in the Roman Empire with the legend of St. Nicholas. And here we have St. Nicholas. He's on the left, and he is throwing gold through the window into the home of this family. These two young women are at the threat of being sold into slavery or into prostitution because their father hasn't been able to come up with a dowry. And so he's arriving at night anonymously, hoping that they'll believe it's coming from God and not from him. And when the father discovers who he is, he asks him not to say anything and, let this be, I don't want any gratitude here. I'm just doing this anonymously. But of course, the legend spreads that it is indeed St. Nicholas. And when you look at the threads that come through to our Christmas traditions, these gold balls can be seen to represent the oranges or the gold coins that we put in our stocking. So I love drawing threads through history, cultural history, and I think that this is a direct thread one can draw. So as I made my way through from the Roman Empire in the research of this project, through the Reformation into Great Britain and the courts of Queen Elizabeth and James I, and coming over to America with the Mayflower and everyone else in Jamestown, by 1809, Washington Irving, the amazing talented Washington Irving, has written Knickerbocker. And Knickerbocker is the first time that we actually see Santa Claus or St. Nicholas introduced in literature in America. And Knickerbocker has 25 references to St. Nicholas, one of them being St. Nicholas flying over the homes of New Yorkers in a wagon. And I don't think I agree with some scholars who've said that without Washington Irving, we wouldn't have Santa Claus, because I think you can see cultural links and ties through other literature. But he was a hugely influential literary character, Washington Irving. Everybody read Knickerbocker, and he was greatly admired. And I just think that he really was an immense talent. He was, I think, considered to be the first really important and notable American writer known on the international stage. You know, I think Benjamin Franklin, of course, but not Benjamin Franklin is in a different genre. But I think that Washington Irving really did make a huge mark and was influential. He was also great friends with Charles Dickens and Sir Walter Scott. And I think when you look at the Santa Claus story and the St. Nicholas story and the influence of Washington Irving, you need to look at Sir Walter Scott, who encouraged him to delve into folklore and folk tales and German folk tales in the German language. And also, Washington Irving visits Sir Walter Scott in Scotland at Abbotsford, and he's inspired by the sort of Scottish superstitions and the Scottish ghosts and all these things. I'm Scottish, so I kind of can understand that. So I think that's a really big piece of this. But then when you turn and you look at Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, which comes 20 years after 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, you see again the influence of Washington Irving in his old Christmas stories. So it's just really been an interesting project to spend time with these amazing, talented people and to see their influence on one another. And one of the reasons it took me so long to do this book was that I didn't just read what these individuals wrote. I read about their lives in great depth, and I read their journals, I read obituaries, I wrote everything I could to understand who these people were and to get to know them. And by doing that, I could, glean influence, but I could also appreciate their society and the influences I think that played upon them. So I just really took my time, and I absolutely loved getting to know Washington Irving. So, James Fenimore Cooper, another really important American writer. Now, he could be credited with being the first American writer to ever actually write the word Santa Claus, because in The Pioneers, which he writes in 1822, he does at the very beginning, when the judge is in a sleigh headed home for Christmas, he turns to his driver and says, "Don't forget, Aggie, tonight, there's Santa Claus coming." It may be, and I think it is, the first time we've ever seen it written in American literature. When you come to the early illustrations of it, I've already mentioned the 1841, 1848, 1855. But by 1862, we have the arrival of F.O.C. Darley to the poem. F.O.C. Darley is considered to be the father of American illustration. Incredibly talented artist, self-taught, and immensely popular. He illustrated Dickens, Cooper, he did everybody. He did Washington Irving's Knickerbocker, he did everybody. And he went simply by the name Darley because he was so incredibly famous and popular. And this is one of my very favorite editions of the poem. I think if one was to say, what is the quintessential Twas, I think this is it. It's a very small little booklet, and there aren't very many illustrations, but they're stunningly beautiful. And they portray Santa Claus as an elf. And I think that's following the language of the poem. So I think it's the integrity of the illustration to the art, to the writing is just, I think it's very well done in this edition. This is the edition that Theodore Roosevelt would have read when he was 4 years of age. And he goes on to read this to his children and his grandchildren. And a copy of this is in his personal library. I just got hold of a copy from an antique dealer from Boston on my recent book tour, which was really thrilling because I had never seen it before. So it's wonderful to see these things, front to back. And it was just, when he said, "I have one of those," I said, "You do?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And it was a very good day. So Here's Prang. As I mentioned, Louis Prang on the back cover of my book, but this is his coming to the poem and having it illustrated. And it's a whimsical little Santa, and it's charming. It's kind of naive art throughout, but it's lovely. It's, again, quintessential Twas, and very rare and highly collectible. This is Jessie Wilcox Smith, who I mentioned at the Drexel with Howard Bly, and she was incredibly talented and so well regarded. She was prolific. She was on the cover of every issue of Good Housekeeping magazine for decades, and she ends up making a great deal of money. She dies quite young, well, in middle age, I guess, but prematurely, and her work is now collected and is very valuable. Her edition is another of the really great editions, and it's produced in facsimile form to this day. You can easily get your hands on a copy of this edition. The original 1912 printings are more rare, of course, and they range in the hundreds of dollars depending on the condition and which printing it is. I saw a 12th printing from 1912 the other day, and be worth a couple of $100. And then I come to this slide. This is a reminder to just mention that when you're doing research like I've been doing, you not only find really interesting things that maybe people haven't sort of shared before related to this poem, but you also find mistakes made. And it's always lovely to be able to correct a record. And there was a publishing of a poem in the Troy Sentinel around the same time as Twas the Night Before Christmas. And it was published anonymously with a preface that said, we don't know who this is, and we think it's somebody from New York, and we don't think it's ever been published before. Well, it was published before. It's actually belonged to Percival, and it was just mistitled. So I was able to, put the title on the right poem and give credit to Percival. But that's not the most interesting thing I found in my research. I spent a lot of time dealing with the suggestion that Clement C. Moore had owned slaves and the controversy that would possibly have, and he didn't. And I can pretty well, say that emphatically because I did a lot of research. I pulled all the slave records. I read a lot. And I also found a journalist in New York who spent 3 months flat out researching this very question. And he's convinced from his research and the research I've done that he did not own slaves. And some of the biographies, not a full-length biography, but some of the sort of fictional stories about Clement C. Moore and this whole sleigh ride and the writing of this poem on Christmas Eve incorporate the idea that he had slaves. And it's not based in fact. And I think that it's an important enough point that needs to be discussed and corrected. It's quite something to write a fictional account of somebody, a historical figure, but when one takes liberties and makes suggestions of things that would be offensive to some people, or most, well, everyone, I think it should be corrected. So I did do that. The other great big story, I think, of the book is the Odell story. And it's not that well reported. I don't think the full story. It's been known for a while that the oldest copy, handwritten copy of the poem is from 1824 watermark paper, and that it's believed to be in the handwriting of Mary Odell. And it's in a Canadian museum up in Fredericton. Mary Odell's father was Jonathan Odell, and Jonathan Odell was Clement C. Moore's godfather, very close to the parents of Clement C. Moore. And he was a surgeon, he was a poet, he was an American. But what happened was during the American Revolution, Jonathan Odell took the side of the British. And he was the one who transcribed all of the correspondence between the British and Andre and Benedict Arnold. And during the defection affair, he was right center of the whole thing. And after the American Revolution, he goes to England and he gets a commission in Canada, and he never comes back to the United States. He does write letters to Clement C. Moore, his godson, and there is communication back and forth. But what was so fascinating for me was that when I was working at the Library of Congress on this, I found a letter from George Washington that gave Jonathan Odell safe passage for life. He didn't know he was a spy. He didn't know. So I think that's a really fun sort of thing to find pertaining to this poem. And that's the kind of, in-depth detail that I found fascinating. And I included in my book because I just think it's those little details that just make it kind of, history come to life through this poem. And then, of course, we all, I've read Spies, or most of us, from Fenimore Cooper, which is this whole story about intrigue and falsified papers and disguising oneself as, having the papers signed by George Washington. So it's kind of fun. Maybe Fenimore Cooper knew this whole story. I don't know. This is the other story, of course, that I just was so excited to share with people. It's Constable Hall. The family of William Constable, who was a very, very interesting character. He was the aide to Comte Lafayette during the American Revolution. His son builds this home up in Constableville, and the family story goes that Clement C. Moore visited this home and was inspired by it and wrote the poem based on this home. It's a very beautiful Regency style house, federal style. It's beautiful. And these were his cousins. And they believed they had a copy of the poem at one time written out by Clement C. Moore. They have a chess set that they say is his, left in the home. And it's a wonderful romantic idea. And I think the reason that intrigues me so much is that this home is 1819 and it's the right era. And so there aren't very many, if any, places one can go and visit and stand, in a room like this that Clement C. Moore may have been in, and very well was. And I was there in September reading the poem to children by, candlelight, and it was really magical. And this is a place that gets lots of snow, and it's just a lovely, lovely museum. And it has beautiful antiques. It has some beautiful French pieces because of William Constable's connection with the French court. So I just think it's something that could be pursued as far as its real relationship to the poem, and it makes a lovely story, and well, it just romanticizes the whole poem too. So we have Thomas Nast, who's, I guess, considered to be, the one who sort of does the portrait of Santa Claus. This is it. Winslow Homer, of course, had come to the Harpers before and had done Santa Claus and other images, but it's really Nast who comes along in the 1860s and starts to work on Santa Claus, which he does for decades. And he's the one who sort of spreads the word about the North Pole, the concept of the North Pole and Santa Claus and the elves and all kinds of other aspects of Santa Claus's life. And he has two young children. They're often depicted in his images of St. Nicholas or Santa Claus and this poem. So, Thomas Nast, I think, is probably centered to the whole thing as far as making Santa Claus more of a human form and so well recognized. He also participates during the Civil War in politicizing the character in Harper. So you have him, handing out presents to the Yankees, So Nast was certainly on the side of the North, and so he was a great friend of politicians and very influential character. So as you move through the 19th century, you start to see all kinds of people come to the poem as printing develops, and you see the color red prominent, predominantly with Santa Claus's costumes, but not always red, but it does start to become much, much more popular. So I was just coming to my book, which we mentioned when I was introduced, about 2012, and how I decided to take the smoking out. And this poem has been done all the way through, from 1830 onward, illustrated in all kinds of ways. And I decided to take the smoking out in 2012 because I've been working on a campaign about tobacco prevention, and I just thought it was a good idea. I also know what children think about smoking, and it kind of bothers them to see a Santa Claus smoking. And so I thought, why not give children of the 21st century an opportunity to have a smoke-free Santa Claus? And it caused an enormous stir. Stephen Colbert got involved, Barbara Walters got involved, the Stephen Colbert Spoof Me, the New York Post got involved, Associated Press, the BBC, and it was actually discussed in Chinese media and in India and in Australia. It just went around the world. It was a really big story, and the book is still, available, and it does really, really well. And I think it just offered people an option. So I just mentioned that because it sort of started this whole crusade of mine to sort of champion Twas and to get out there and make sure this poem has, another 200 years ahead of it. But I must say that I've been on book tour for 3 weeks solid, and overwhelmingly grandfathers have been the ones who sort of flock to my book, whatever event I go to. And I think that's because they read it as a child, and then they read it to their own children, and now they're reading it to their grandchildren. And if those little children can fall in love with it the way that some of us have, then it will be secured, because it's such a part of family holiday time and this magical night of the year, which celebrates this poem. And I think that secures its future. So it's been really rewarding for me to see these grandparents buying my book and enjoying it and learning all this history about this wonderful poem. So this is, again, just one of my favorite pages from my book. And, the poem was written to be fun and lively and cheerful and bright and full of hope. And I think that's why it survived. It's really interesting to look at some of the work that came out prior to 1822. Poems that talk about St. Nicholas, but they talk about a birchen rod, or they talk about, the threat of punishment. Twas has no reference at all to naughty or nice, and there's no birchen rod, and there's nothing to dread is even in the poem, in the language of the poem. So it's benevolent, and it's non-judgmental, and it's inclusive. So I think those are some of the reasons it survived so long. And I also think it's easy to memorize and loved in childhood. And some of these things, when you fall in love with them in childhood, they carry on. I'm always asked about Rudolph when children see this. Rudolph is such a huge character, but he comes so much later. There were only 8 reindeer in Twas the Night Before Christmas, and several of them are named. You see their names referenced in much earlier literature. You also see, even a line from Hamlet, not a mouse stirring, is from Hamlet. And so the language of the poem, like, people will ask me, well, who invented the names of the reindeer? You can find these names in other literary references that predate Twas the Night Before Christmas. And Donner and Blitzen is actually a saying, thunder and lightning, in German and in Dutch, so in different spellings. So this is my book project. I just loved working on it, and I have been collecting the poem since the beginning. I guess I started working on this, but I've had my own edition from my childhood always with me. It's one of my most cherished possessions, and I just decided to build a small collection because some of these, you just really want to see them, not just an image. You want to hold the book. You want to see how it was put together and all of the illustration. And one of my favorites is W.W. Denslow, who did The Wizard of Oz, but he did this poem and the little illustrations, the little vignettes it's just a really magical edition. People like Holly Hobby have done it twice. It's fun to see how over the years she changed her styles and how she, reinvented the illustrations, and depending on her circumstances in her life, and the fact that she had a young family and had moved to a farm, and how that influenced her art. So I bought an edition today of Tasha Tudor for someone because it has little corgis, and it's just fun to see all these different editions. There's about, I think, 1,700 to 2,000 individual editions of this poem in print. And there's more coming out every single year as artists come to the poem inspired by it. So my book is also available in Spanish, And last year, my Spanish in America sold more than my English, which was really interesting. That was the first time that had happened. I haven't seen the sales for this year, but it was really interesting. So I just wanted to say that Twas has had an influence on so much of our Christmas culture. This is St. Nicholas magazine. This was a magazine that ran for decades and was very influential in bringing all kinds of people to the fore, such as Kipling. And I have seen so many sort of offshoots from the poem. The Grinch is one, Charlie Brown's Christmas. It's hard to imagine all of this, coming up without Twas the Night Before Christmas. It is at the very center of all of these few later works. And I just wanted to end with saying this before I take questions. It is about hope. This poem is full of hope. It's full of wonderment, belief, positivity. And it's also, although it's based in Christian language, as in Christmas, the Supreme Court of America ruled that it is an overreach to deny Santa Claus, to say that one could not display Santa Claus in a school in America or to put it in a public building. He is, after all, an elf, and he is a character that has been loved and shared for centuries in American history and centuries in Western culture. And so the Supreme Court made a ruling that it's an overreach to deny Santa Claus. And that came from a couple of schools that were sending out memos saying, just a memo, nobody put up Santa Claus on your windows this year. But that they ruled that is not appropriate. He is, after all, an elf. And elves are okay. So this is just one last image of another beautiful vintage edition of the poem by Dorcas. So I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Great.
I learned so much about Clement Moore that I had no idea. So it's interesting that there isn't a biography of him. Were there any other, was he a writer beyond this poem? Anything else that he did that we might know about?
Well, Twas the Night Before Christmas is by far the most famous, and he was a very serious academic, and he didn't really want to be known for writing a juvenile, piece of poetry. So he did the first Hebrew lexicon in America, and he wrote other really serious works. And he does write other poetry, which is it's called Poems of 1844. One of them is a poem about taking his children to Saratoga Springs. It's kind of fun, but nothing compares to Twas. I mean, nothing's as good as Twas.
It's interesting because we did a book talk a couple weeks ago on a new book about Lydia Mariah Child, who's another very academic person who did a lot of very serious work for abolition in the United States, but
Yes.
what she's remembered for is, Over the River and Through the Woods to Grandfather's House We Go.
Yes.
When you say that, people go, oh yeah, I've heard of her. But they they're not familiar with the really serious work that she did.
Right.
Do you know when, I'm just curious, you talked a lot about the first depictions of this poem. Do you know when the first time it was put on, a depiction was put on film?
It was a silent film.
Mm-hmm.
I think I've got it in my book, early 1900s. Okay. Very early.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite version or illustration? Of course, the ones you showed for your book were very sweet and very cute. So beyond your own version and those illustrations, do you have another favorite that you really like? Or
I think the FOC Darley is my favorite. And I love E.F. Manning, a woman again. Lots of women did this from the late 1890s. Her edition is beautiful, and I think the elf is just stunning. The Santa elf character she comes up with, I think, is really, really terrific. Nice. And he's in a green outfit, so. And I think that the Denslow is right up there too, because it's so creative. And Denslow, I think you'll all know, he illustrated The Wizard of Oz,
Mhm.
and he made so much money off of The Wizard of Oz that he bought an island and called himself King Denslow. So he's kind of a character. So I spent a lot of time getting to know all of these illustrators as well. I read their stories, and really, really fun. The other great, I guess, well, there's just so many. As I mentioned, I went to Oklahoma and I visited a man who has 1,000 copies in a vault because of the tornadoes.
Wow.
And it took me 4 days to go through the whole thing.
Yeah.
But the people have, collections out there all over the place. The Barbara Perone at the Westchester University is a good 1,000 pieces. I get contact from people who have hundreds of editions, and I think that the big institutions have most of them, like most of the old editions. We could find almost every edition ever done, at least one copy of it. There's a couple of copies of the Troy Sentinel. And the really big collector was Jock Elliott of Ogilvy, out of Manhattan, the advertising agency. And he collected, but when he died in 2006, they auctioned it all off. So it's all just scattered, which is very unfortunate. He had a lot of Dickens as well.
Wow. Someone in the audience is asking, can you tell us more about the inside cover of your book? Is that a particular image?
It's just Career and Ives. I think I picked it because it's so nostalgic.
So
I really wanted that image of just nostalgia, because that's what this poem is to so many people. It brings back so many memories of Christmas, and I just thought that was really important. I think that my favorite chapter to work on was the Civil War, because the art was, we're talking about Winslow Homer, and we're talking about Longfellow, the poetry. So it's pretty great. But it was also a difficult chapter, but it's really important. And then you have Nass coming to it, and it's that whole era, really, really important for the poem, because it's published on both sides of the conflict, and it's politicized on both sides with editorials that run before it. Really, really interesting. And you had to pull all the old newspapers to do that. But when you pull old newspapers, you don't just get the articles or what you're looking for, you get a lot more. Right? It's always so fascinating. You go, oh, look at this image. Like, wow, I found things,
It's amazing what you find in like a newspaper when you're looking for something else.
Yes.
There's a lot in there.
Yes.
So, I mean, this is, like I said, it's a gorgeous book. I put the link in the chat, folks. You can purchase your copy from Maine Historical Society. Our online store is mainhistorystore.com. You can also visit us in person at our Congress Street location. We're open Tuesday through Saturday. We've got lots of great merchandise for the season. And don't forget, if you're an MHS member, you get a 10% discount, 20% on the day when you join. And I was also sharing too, Pamela was talking a lot about how traditions around the holidays developed and changed. And that's something that we get into on our Comfort and Joy tours, our special holiday tours of the Wadsworth Longfellow House. So if you're interested in those, those are gonna be Saturday the 17th, and you can buy those tickets online at mainhistory.org. So I know you've just finished like this big book tour, and you're just kind of finally getting back home, and that this was a project that took many years, but what do you think you'll do next?
Well, there's a couple of movie producers have contacted me about possibly doing a documentary or something. So that would be really great.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Well, let us know when that gets off the ground. Let us know, and we'd love to do a screening at MHS. Yeah.
Okay, that would be great. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Pamela. This was a really fun and really interesting topic, and a great evening. And thank you so much, everyone in our audience, for joining us. And Pamela, next time you're in Maine, please let us know and stop by and visit us in Portland.
Great, I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye.